Hey listeners, thanks for dropping in. I'm Christy.
And I'm Melissa. And this is Buried Motives, where we dig deep into the details of some of the most gruesome
dirtbag murderers.
Hey listeners.
Welcome back to Buried Motives.
We have got a treat for you today.
We do. Today we have a guest, and she's a returning one.
Kim's joining us from A Million Other Choices.
You might remember from after our first year of podcasting, we had her on and she told us the story of her niece, Taylor Toller.
And we've also done a collab for Valentine's Day with her. So we're excited that Kim's here and she's going to share a case with us.
So welcome, Kim.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me on again.
Kim started her podcast around the same time as us. And so we've been going through the trenches together.
Yeah, we both started in August of 2021, and we've just been burning through cases every week.
Yep. Well, we appreciate you joining us. And so we'll just let you get right into it.
Sure. Well, I appreciate you guys having me. I actually have for you today, it's a historical case. And I used to not really like historical cases because I feel, I don't know, a little bit kind of removed from the story. When they happened a long time ago, it's hard to picture the places and even just how they were dressing and stuff like that. But I've learned in my research that I actually really love history, and I like it because I like case law. Like, I like to know, well, why are certain things laws now, and where did they come from, and how did some things that have happened in the past change how we relate to certain laws now? So that's why I've decided to do this case. There is quite a bit of me trying to pronounce some French words, which I'm not very good at, but I'm going to do my best. And there's
we always love that.
Yeah. There's a couple of people named Marie Anne in the story too, but I'll try and keep it clear. But it's a really important Canadian case when it comes to children's welfare laws and some of our changing ideas in society about children, hopefully for the better. But of course, cases like this continue to happen all over the place.
Unfortunately.
So this is the murder of Aurore Gagnon. And the case is actually referred to a lot as the mysterious death of the murdered child, but it's not really a mystery at all, as you're going to see. And I feel really horrible for the suffering and the untimely death of Aurore, but I'm not actually sure why she's referred to as martyred, because to me that kind of infers that she was killed or willingly gave her life for religious beliefs, and that really has nothing to do with her story. So I don't know if martyred meant something else back in the early 1900s, but I'm not going to refer to it that way. It is just a sick, reprehensible, despicable story, and I think a very preventable murder.
It's always hard when it's one about a child.
It is, yes.
And perhaps they called her a martyr because maybe they viewed her as more saintly.
It could be.
Yeah.
Or it's because of the changes that come about.
It could also be, it's difficult when you're doing research when you have to translate from French to English. Sometimes things get lost in translation. So maybe it meant something completely different. But little Aurore was born on May 31st in 1909 to her parents Télesphore and Marie Anne. Now, her maiden name was Karen, but she's the first of a couple of Marie Annes that we're going to be talking about today. And they were farmers and loggers living in Saint-Philomene de Forteville, Quebec. I mean, if I mispronounced that, I'm sure I did. That's where they were, in the county of Lot-Benier. And again, I'm just giving the pronunciations my best shot. And together, Télesphore and Marie-Anne had 4 children. And Aurore isn't really described anywhere in any of the archives or articles that I came across. But based on some testimony later, I would say that she was a very passive, very quiet young girl. Back in the day, I think a lot of kids like her spoke only when spoken to. She just did what she was asked to do. And Télesphore and Marie-Anne had married in 1906. They were devout Roman Catholics. So their first child, Marie-Jeanne, was born in August of 1907. They then had another daughter, Lucinda, who was born in 1908, I think, and then Aurore. And then they also had 2 sons, Georges in 1910, followed by the baby of the family, Joseph, in 1915. But a few months after Joseph had been born, Marie Anne came down with tuberculosis and had to be hospitalized. And tuberculosis is a bacterial infection of the lungs, but back in the day, it used to be called consumption. It's highly contagious. It was referred to as the White Death.
And oftentimes they had to be institutionalized if you had it.
Yes. And actually, before the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of folklore around it that people with tuberculosis were almost seen like vampires, that when one family member died of the disease, of course, many other family members would follow after. And so they believed that the infected person caused the other people in the family to die very slowly because they were basically draining the life energy from those family members. And
wow.
Yeah, I love the little bits of research. Like I love that part.
Yeah, it is interesting. It's not only is your poor family dying of the sickness, but then everyone around you is viewing you as a monster.
Yeah, exactly. And in the early 1900s, it was really common amongst the urban poor population, so in the farms and industrial workers. And believe it or not, the cattle version of it is very, very similar to the human version, so it can be passed to humans, but they didn't know that until about the early 1900s. And so that's when they started to pasteurize milk. And then that kind of helped reduce some of the infections in humans.
I love disease history.
Yeah.
It is fascinating.
Living nearby Télesphore, he had a cousin named Napoleon and his wife, Marie Anne Hood. Now, his cousin had passed away, leaving Marie Anne Hood as a widow. She was in her 30s and raising her two sons, Gerald and Henry. So Marie Anne Hood and Napoleon, they actually had 6 children together during their marriage before he passed away. But 4 of her children had died, which in the early 1900s was unfortunately a pretty normal thing. So when Marie and Karen went into the hospital with tuberculosis, it made perfect sense for Marie Anne Hood to come to live at the Gagnon farm and to take care of her children as well as Télesphore's children so that he could continue to work on the farm. And so that was in early 1916 sometime. And in the early 1900s here in Canada, the life expectancy of people wasn't what it is now. Like in the late 1880s, there was a smallpox outbreak. In 1909, polio made its way into Canada. 1911, it was typhoid. And then, of course, there was a Spanish flu epidemic. And according to the Canadian Medical Association, 29% of Canadians at the time had a venereal disease. I find that very interesting. Mm-hmm. Not really sure what was going on around then, but yeah, venereal disease is a big thing as well. So the life expectancy...
There was a lot going on around then.
Yeah.
And a lot of misinformation about how things were spread.
Exactly. So the life expectancy of the average Canadian at that time was only 32 years old. So it kind of puts things into a little bit of perspective there. And so in 1900, there was about 200 out of every 1,000 babies. They didn't survive their first year. So back then it wasn't unusual for a woman, especially one like if you're Roman Catholic, to give birth to like 9 or 10 children, but only have maybe 2 or 3 of them make it to adulthood. So life wasn't just a lot of more work back then, but trauma and tragedy was just really commonplace. And in today's world, I cannot imagine the loss of one child, let alone to have, several of your children die from just disease. Farm accidents were a big thing. I can't imagine the life back then.
No, that would be awful.
Yeah. And on November 6, 1917, 2-year-old little Joseph was found suffocated by the straw mattress that they used as his bed. Now, straw mattresses were a thing that they used in farmhouses, and he had somehow gotten himself wedged. Well, it says under the mattress, but I think kind of it would be more like in between where the straw mattress met like a wall of some sort. And then sadly, about 2 months later, on January 23rd, 1918, Marie Anne Karen passed away at the Beauport Asylum from her tuberculosis. So this story is already very sad, and we haven't even really got to the sad part yet. And about 2 weeks later, on February 1st, 1918, Télesphore and Marie Anne Hood got married. And again, this was pretty customary. Like a single dad was just kind of unheard of back then. So it wasn't something that the neighbors all kind of tissed about. It was just was kind of the natural order of things to make sure that Télesphore could still put food on the table for his kids, and then Marie-Anne could take care of all the children. It's just kind of life goes on kind of thing back then.
Yeah, it was almost like a necessity of life for them.
Yeah, it definitely would have been. And by April of 1919, Marie-Anne had given birth to a child that she also had with Télesphore, but I'm not sure if it was a girl or a boy. And then after their mother's death, the 3 surviving Gagnon children, including Aurore, went to live for a little bit with her grandparents in Leckerville, but returned to the family farm in the summer of 1919. So Aurore was 10 at that time. And in September, Aurore was hospitalized for about a month or so because of an infection on her leg that wasn't healing up. But it finally did get better after about a month in the hospital. And then she returned home to her father and to Marie-Anne's care as her stepmother. And on February 12th, 1920, the county doctor, his last name was Lafond, I can't really pronounce his first name. He was summoned to the house to check on Aurore, who again had become quite sick. And he found her, Aurore, she was 11 at the time, in her bed, in a coma and covered in what he described as strange wounds. So she was quickly taken to the hospital where she died during the night. Now, deaths of children were actually pretty commonplace from lots of different illnesses and that. So they didn't normally do autopsies on children. But because of these strange wounds that they found on her, that they thought that there was something a little bit odd about it. So they did an autopsy on her. But it also could have been because one of their neighbors said, as they were sort of carting Aurore out of the house, people will talk, and rightly so. So whatever the reason that they did this autopsy, I mean, probably at the time they were hoping that they would discover like a new illness. Well, not hoping that they're going to discover a new illness, but like, thinking that there was something, like she might have caught something because these wounds on her were quite strange. They'd just never seen anything like it before. But they've definitely thought that something was amiss for sure.
And Kim, did they describe what the wounds looked like why they were unusual?
Yeah, so what they found was that there was a total of 54 of these lesions on her body, and they basically covered her from head to toe. Now, her cause of death at the time, they said, was generalized blood poisoning resulting from sepsis. So each one of these wounds had become infected and then had led to sepsis. Now, but they believe that the injuries themselves, or these lesions, had actually been caused by a number of blunt and sharp force traumas that had been inflicted on her. Including finding that her skull had been fractured and was still caked at the time in like blood and pus and that. Yeah, it was bad, really bad. And then her left thigh had been severely swollen, and the skin on her hands and wrist had been literally like torn and ripped down to the bone.
So all of these injuries obviously didn't happen right away. It sounds like they're in different stages of healing.
Yes. And so what he determined was that the wounds had become infected, but the wounds themselves could only have been the result of actual blows to her body. Now, it wasn't too hard to figure out who had happened to Aurore. I mean, the neighbors and even the parish priests were able to, they had stories of witnessing Marie-Anne Hood, the stepmother, and sometimes Télesphore beating Aurore with like sticks or a strap, sometimes with the handle of an axe.
Oh my goodness.
She was burned, and this is in front of witnesses, right? She was burned with a metal fire poker. She was forced to eat bread, which was soaked in lye, which is highly caustic. And it was also well known and talked about around town that Marie-Anne had tried to poison Aurore by making her drink detergent. And there was a rumor going around that on at least one occasion she had made her eat her own feces.
Oh my goodness.
Were they singling her out, or were they doing this to all the children? Like, what about Aurora was so bad?
Well, it feels like some of the other children did get some of this treatment, but not as bad as Aurore. And well, I'll get to what Marie-Anne says about it in a little bit here, but it's awful. But the part that at this point you might be wondering is, how could nobody have come forward and tell authorities that Aurore was in this kind of danger and that she was being this horribly abused by her stepmother and her father? And well, the reason was that
You minded your business at that time.
There was a couple of reasons, right? I mean, people followed the teachings of the church. And in the church always said at that time that it was spare the rod, spoil the child, those kinds of things. And although it obviously doesn't mean to this extent, but in 1916, women and children were pretty much considered property, like not people. Like if you want to slam your car into a tree several times a day, it's none of my business, right? I personally wouldn't do it, but you're free to take care of your possessions however you want to. But probably the biggest reason why people didn't intervene at the time was there was no options. There's no child protective services. There's no foster care. They did have orphanages, but they were reserved for children that had been abandoned or who had been given to the church by their parents, not just parents that were doing this terrible job of parenting. So Télesphore and Marianne, they didn't feel they had to hide their actions from neighbors or anybody, right? Because you could do what you wanted to your child, right? I mean, you have a child that's misbehaving. You can beat them until there's blood on them to get them to behave whatever you needed to do.
And was she misbehaving?
It doesn't sound like it. It sounds like I don't really know anything about her as a person because the source documents just don't really talk, which is sad. They just don't talk about her as a child. But in the early 1900s, she might have been considered like a willful child. And it doesn't even matter. Like she could have been an outright brat for all we know, right? But like I said, you could beat your children for whatever reasons you wanted to. You could neglect them, but you couldn't kill them. So I believe that like everyone around town, the coroners, detectives, doctors, all felt that what Télesphore and Marianne had done and was doing to this child went well beyond any of this spare the rod, spoil the child type of punishments. But until she died as a direct result of the abuse, which I wouldn't even use the term abuse, I mean, it's torture that she suffered, there was no crime. So what they did, because the detectives at the time and the coroner felt very strongly that she had to have died as a direct result of what was being done to her and that what they were doing was criminal. So what they did is they held a coroner's inquest into the matter, which is basically when a couple of coroners and some witnesses kind of show their findings to a jury of some death investigators to determine if they can or should file criminal charges, because they needed to figure out, did Aurore die because of something that was done to her, as in it was a murder, or did she die because of sepsis from these infected and untreated wounds? And of course, after hearing from the coroners and some of the neighbors and even Télesphore himself and Marie-Jeanne, Aurore's oldest sister, she testified, they said that no, she had definitely been murdered.
Definitely, because even if it was from the sepsis, that was still caused by the wounds.
Yeah, it seems like a moot point.
Yeah, but remember, at that time, the coroners wouldn't have had the same access to forensics that we do now. So the causes of death were a little bit more loose, right? They would have been like, oh, well, sepsis obviously killed her. And that was her cause of death. So it was really about kind of trying to determine the manner of her death. How did she get septic in the first place? And so they definitely declared that it was a murder.
That's good.
Yeah. So her funeral was held on Valentine's Day in 1920. And then after the Mass, Télesphore and now again pregnant Marianne were arrested and charged with the murder of Aurore. They were both held in Quebec City to await a preliminary hearing to determine if there was enough evidence against them to even go to trial for murder, which was still not a given at that time. So the preliminary hearing is closed hearing, so no one alive knows what went on in there. But the outcome was that Télesphore and Marianne Hood went on trial for murder, but separately.
Okay.
So the trial for Marianne Hood began on Tuesday, April 13th, 1920. So it was just 2 months after Aurore had died, and it took about a week or so under Justice Louis Philippe Pelletier. So during the month of April, he had actually given out 3 death sentences on trials that he'd heard that month. So it was looking good for justice, at least, let's say that. During the trial, the surviving Gagnon children and Aurore's siblings and her own son, Gerald, this is Marianne Hood's son, Gerald, gave testimony about the abuse that she had suffered at the hands of her stepmother. And because the evidence against Marianne was so overwhelming and clearly showed that she had gone beyond any reasonable, even for the time, punishment of a child.
It wasn't punishment, it was abuse.
So now her defense decided to plead insanity. based on the fact that she was pregnant and the hormones. It was hormones made her so darn psychotic. It was also claimed by the defense that Marie-Anne had been abused herself as a child and was henceforth always prone to these hormonal storms that they were called, and often enraged by Aurore's passiveness. So now she claims that, well, she didn't misbehave at all. She wasn't a willful child and disregard any of the rules, but how she felt she was misbehaving is by being passive. She was underreactive and unemotional towards Marie-Anne and her tirades.
She was probably terrified.
Yes, I would imagine. And of course, you're raised right from the beginning, from the day you're born, to obey your parents.
Right.
And on the last day of her trial, Justice Pelletier gave his instructions to the jury, which took almost 3 hours to give them the instructions. And he was pretty clear that he didn't want them given any consideration to these pleas of her pregnancy craziness. And the jury deliberated for all of 10 minutes and then came back with a guilty verdict. And so with that, Justice Pelletier, who had to himself do his best to choke back his own tears, gave her a sentence of death by hanging, which was going to happen on October 1st, 1920 at 8 o'clock in the morning, to be very precise. So it would have been about 3 months after she was expected to give birth to the twins, it turned out, that she was carrying.
Wow.
Now, Télesphore's trial started 2 days later on April 23rd, 1920. Now, that one was under Justice Joseph Alfred Dessy, but his trial was a little bit shorter. It only lasted for about 5 days and only really took that long because of all the testimony and all the exhibits had to be translated from French into English for all the English-speaking jury. And now, he had clearly participated in the abuse and torture that Aurore had suffered, but claimed that he had only done it because he'd been manipulated by Marie-Anne, who would tell him all kinds of lies and horror stories about the things that Aurore had done while he was away working in the fields.
That's quite the defense for a man at that time to go with, to admit to being manipulated by a woman.
Well, it was her hormones. Her hormones got a hold of him.
Yeah, you don't want to get in the way of a woman and her hormones when she's pregnant. Yeah.
But what man would admit that at that time?
One who could be hung for his actions.
Yeah, I guess.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that wasn't his only excuse for it. He also said, wasn't it a father's right to discipline a child that is being difficult? And that would have been a standard defense back then, that you could do whatever you wanted to your kids because they were considered property. Right. And he figured his abuse of Aurore wasn't nearly as bad as the things that Marie-Anne was doing. You know, after all, he had only beaten his daughter. It was Marie-Anne that had actually branded her with a hot metal poker and made her drink detergent and feces. And believe it or not, I guess that the jury actually bought it and decided that he had not intended for his daughter to die of these injuries. So he was only convicted of manslaughter, but he was still given a life sentence for it at St. Vincent de Paul prison, but he did not get the death sentence.
Which is so surprising because Marie-Anne had already said that she was a passive child.
Yeah, his biological child.
Yeah.
But that's probably why they bought it. Because what parent can believe that somebody else could do those kind of things to your biological child? They would believe the evil stepmother story for sure.
Yeah.
That's been toted through the media even way back then. But your biological child, it would be so hard to believe that somebody would do that to your own flesh and blood.
Yeah. But he did, and he watched it happen and didn't do anything to stop it. Now, the twins that Marie-Anne was pregnant with at the time were born in July of 1920. There was a boy and a girl. They were born in the prison, and they got to stay with her until they were weaned. And then I can only assume that they were given either to other relatives or like a church-run orphanage. Hopefully the latter, then adopted into a decent and loving family. But no one actually knows what became of the twins, where they lived out their days. Neither of them are, of course, likely alive now, seeing that they would be 104. But, you never know.
Probably not. But hopefully they had good lives.
I really hope so. I really hope so. Well, 5 years later, in 1925, Télesphore was actually paroled. Now, it was in part to his good behavior, and the other part was because he said he was suffering from throat cancer, which was supposed to be terminal. It turns out it wasn't. And then he was returned to his hometown, which I struggle to pronounce, and continued to write letters to Marie Anne while she was in prison. He then later married Marie Laurie Habel on January 8th, 1938. And then he worked out his days as a carpenter and largely stayed out of the spotlight. Now, Marie Anne managed to have a little bit of a horseshoe up her bottom, and a bunch of opposers to the death penalty started a campaign to commute her sentence to life, writing a whole schwack of letters to the Minister of Justice in Ottawa. And even though Justice Pelletier himself wrote to the Minister of Justice saying it was ridiculous to keep her alive on this earth, this sentence was in fact commuted to life on September 29th, so only 2 days before her execution had been scheduled for. Now, a big part of the opposition to her death sentence was that it would be, some of the things they come up with is just ridiculous. It would have been damaging for her twins for them to be forced to be weaned too early. So,
what?
Yeah. So when she was taken off death row in Quebec City, she was then transferred to the Kingston Penitentiary in Ontario. So yeah, that was the whole reason for the most part that they gave for why they commuted her sentence to life, is because, it would be very unfair to wean her of her children.
But
she wasn't going to be raising anyways.
Right.
They couldn't just postpone it?
Yeah, I don't know.
Or leave them in the care of an abusive murderer?
Yeah. I don't understand. But she still didn't think she got a fair deal, even considering the alternative had been death. So while in Kingston, she started writing letters asking for early release to return to her family to take care of her children, like the ones that she hadn't killed, I guess. And she continued to appeal for her release for years, constantly complaining that it wasn't fair, that Télesphore had gotten out after 5 years, and she had to serve a life sentence for what she considered to be the same crime. And she claimed that it was sexist and that she had been treated unfairly based on her gender and a whole bunch of blah, 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 which I agree that the system is sexist, but usually it's in the other direction when it comes to prison sentences. Like usually women get lighter sentences than men. So I don't really know what she's going on about. Then in 1935, she got breast cancer that spread to her lungs, and it was terminal, only hers was terminal, and not just maybe terminal like the way Télesphore's had been. So she was released out of passionate circumstances and then released into her cousin's care in Montreal. Now, she died on May 12th of 1936. Now, Télesphore came out of his obscurity a couple of times over the years, because the case of Aurore Gagnon became really the stuff of Quebec legends, and there were books and plays and all kinds of things written about her. And he would go to these plays and he would say things like, well, that was it, and it wasn't it. And then in 1951, there was a movie that was going to be released. I think how you say it in English is The Mystery of the Martyred Child. But him and some family members of his filed for an injunction to stop the film's release because it would ruin his reputation.
My goodness.
Yeah, poor child. But it didn't work. The film was released anyways. And then he died on August 30th, 1961, at the age of 78, and still living in the same town that Aurore had lived and died in. Now, the last updates that I could find were that Marie Jean, who was Télesphore's oldest daughter, she died in 1986. And in 2005, there was another film that came out. This one was just called Aurore. It is in French. It's directed by Luc Dion, and it did win a Genie Award in 2006. I believe it's still available on YouTube. And then on December 7th, 2015, so fairly recently, Aurore Gagnon was recognized by her town as a historical figure for the spark in public interest that her death caused into cases of domestic violence and child abuse, and just sort of a reminder to all of us that silence in the face of injustice does more harm than good. So
absolutely,
if you see something, say something. Yes. And so that was the horrible and historical story of the torture and death of Aurore Gagnon.
Wow. There's a lot to unpack with that story.
There is a lot to unpack. And it's so tragic that these kinds of things have to happen in order to change the laws. Now that somebody has to go through what Aurore went through just for society to decide, you know what, we need to treat children better and they need to be protected.
Yeah, that they're not your property.
Right. I guess to be fair, they had no one to go to with it. But
right.
There's a thing called public shaming, right? When society has their own standards, just looking down on them for what they were doing might have changed some of their behavior.
Instead, he was welcomed back into the community. Like, they didn't run him out of the community. That's crazy. It took them till 2015 to honor her, all the while they had harbored her murderer.
Yeah. And I can't even believe that he went to plays about it. Why would you even want to relive that horrible experience?
Well, and I think he just wanted to know what
probably wasn't horrible
saying about him.
Yeah, it was all about him. He didn't really care. It doesn't sound like either were remorseful at all. Because if she had over 50 wounds on her body, that had to have been going on for a long time. And if people were seeing her being abused right on their front property, what was happening behind doors?
Yeah, I don't even want to think about it. Yeah, so Aurore was 10 when Marie Anne came into her life and 11 when she died. So over the course of a year, that's a lot. Like, it doesn't sound like it even amped up. It just kind of was right from day one she was doing this to her.
Just a full-on escalation of it.
Yeah.
And Kim, do you know if there was reports of the abuse even before Marie Anne came into the family?
No, I wasn't able to find anything about how her life had been when it was Télesphore and Marie Anne Karen, her biological mom. It sounds like the mums back then, they would have, I think, been the ones that decided how the children were. I know they didn't always do the disciplining. Like, I knew that fell to the men a lot of times in those cases. But I think even just like it is today, really, us mums, we set the tone for how our children are going to be treated. So I don't think that there's any evidence that her biological mom was in any way abusive towards her.
Or didn't encourage her dad to be either.
Yeah.
Right. And I think by the sounds of it, Télesphore did whatever he was told to do by the women in his life.
He probably just couldn't be bothered. Let them tend to the children.
Right.
That's why he got married so quickly each time. So he wouldn't have to take care of them.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Because men, on their own, it's hard. It's hard. You have to make your own sandwiches and stuff. And so, especially back then, you would not be single for very long. Like, you would be like, I need a wife. I need someone to take care of. Even if they don't even have children, they just need someone to darn their socks and stuff.
Yeah, because that's how it was.
Yeah.
Good thing a lot of these things have changed.
But it is sad that it took her death to bring about change.
Right.
It is a crime to beat and neglect children. To me, that's just like, well, of course it's a crime. You don't do that to animals, let alone children.
It is hard to wrap your head around the mentality that existed so long ago because it's so different now.
Yeah.
And even the fact that they both got released early from prison because the dad had a sore throat.
Yeah, exactly.
It was probably strep.
And he might die. Yeah. Well, even just the argument that the pregnancy could have, first of all, anything to do with her behavior without any kind of like diagnosis of any kind of psychosis or anything. And that the hormones would cause her to act recklessly and with violence. Yeah. And then the whole argument about weaning her children. Like, it's everything is strange back then. Very strange.
It's true.
It is one of the reasons why I love actually researching those old time cases.
Yes. Yeah.
And so thank you for bringing one to us this week, Kim. We really appreciate you joining us.
Yeah, well, like I said, I was happy to be on. I'm glad we do these little things every once in a while to just kind of, bring our own perspectives to the shows.
Definitely. And our listeners, we hope that you'll go check out Kim's podcast, A Million Other Choices. She does a really great job.
You guys should definitely check her out. And we hope you'll join us again next week when Christy has another case for us.
Until then,
see ya.
Bye. And Kim, did they just, sorry.
So he determined, sorry, go ahead. Anyways, so.
Sorry.
What am I trying to say here? And.
That's quite, sorry.
Yeah, you guys make me lose my spot all the time. Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
We're used to doing this, interrupting each other.
Yeah.
Another Sound Off Media Company podcast.